Hey everyone, it's May, and if you want to be cool like me, you should subscribe to Flake on Patreon. But now, here's the Instant Speed podcast on 983 Media.
This is the Instant Speed Podcast, episode number 84. Our guest today is Tariq Patel, two-time national champion, as always brought to you by FAB Cards. Go to kfabecards.com. Now, I am racing the construction noise, so I got to be quick. The calling in Antwerp was won by Pablo Pintor, bringing Oldhim to living legend status. Also, Battle Lake Frigid occurred this past weekend in Hamburg, New York. Had a great time casting 2 days. A wicked trophy, lots of cool people playing. It was awesome. Besides that, we got new cards, friends. We've got Alluring Inducement, a Shayana specialization, as well as a new token, Eloquence. Awesome. Another piece is I'm going to be in Pittsburgh this weekend for the RTN at Green Tree Sports. You got to check that out. I'll be casting alongside Charmer. And finally, sorry to zoom through this, but the last little bit here is that the Japanese and Belgian print are going to both be carrying those wicked cool 10 ofs artist-proof chase cards in Dusk Till Dawn. So it doesn't change the seeding. There will be 10 of each, but Japanese print will also get a chance to get some of those sweet, sweet cards. All right, we got Tariq Patel on the show. We talk about Oldhim hitting living legend, what that means. How about the barrier to entry conversation? We dig into all of this today on Instant Speed. This episode of Instant Speed Podcast is brought to you by FAB Cards. Located in Utah, FAB Cards is a smart choice for all of your flesh and blood needs. Prepare for the battles you'll face through the world of Wraith by gearing up at kfabecards.com. That's KAYFABECARDS.com and get all of the cards shipped directly to your door. Hey, if Magic or Pokemon is your jam, they've got you covered. FAB Cards has a plethora of TCG options, sealed products, and singles to keep you collecting and keep you competitive. FAB Cards, be who you want to be. The Instant Speed Podcast welcomes back a two-time national champion. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff, but frankly, I think that it's like, at this point, it's just too much. I'm sure you're clicking through the little intro I wrote, but I try to be flowery. But at this point, I think laziness is the better thing, but it's nice to see you, Tariq. How are you, buddy?
Nice to be back. I'm doing well. How are you, Flake?
I'm good, man. Nobody asked me that. It's very rare that people ask me how I'm doing. I'm good. I got a dermatologist appointment tomorrow. And like, I don't know. It's just a matter of, I feel weirded out when somebody's got to like count all my spots and like look at my skin. Like skin is like the creepiest thing out of everything. Does that not bother you? Like, is skin the weirdest thing for you as a doctor?
Here's a fun fact. The skin is actually the largest organ in the body. A lot of people don't know that the skin is actually an organ in of itself. But no, it doesn't weird me out. I actually love derm procedures, cutting stuff out, Botox, fillers, injections. So that's right up my wheelhouse.
You're gross. That's it. That's all. It's like, I don't know what else to say. All right. So let's just get to it. There's a lot to dig into. The juicier aspect being some of the tweet exchanges. We'll get to those later. I want to talk about what is a little bit more recent, which is the fact that Living Legend has a new member. It's Oldhim, as Pablo Pintor won the calling in Antwerp on the old boy. So talk to us a little bit about Oldhim and the significance of it attaining Living Legend, and just like sort of like a more so an overhead view, like a bird's eye view of what the landscape is going to look like. Because I know that you put a lot of work in on Oldhim, so you know more or less what it feels like. I think that part of Team Dragon Shield as well, a lot of them ran Oldhim at RTNs and such, but just in general, talk to us a little bit about the significance of Oldhim hitting Living Legend.
Yeah, so Oldhim first came out during Tales of Aria, and Oldhim's really been dominant in metagames where Prism is almost non-existent or simply banned. So we first saw its first major win in the hands of the GOAT, Michael Hamilton, during Nationals. I apologize for my dogs in the background. They're getting excited.
Oh, it's okay. Is that so? It's Bailey and Brownie.
Bailey and Brownie, and they probably see a squirrel outside, which is why they're going crazy.
Those squirrel bastards. They're always just like infringing on territory. It's all good. Don't worry about it. I like dogs.
All right, so Oldham's been, really, really good when Briar was a predominant deck, when Chain was around. But the minute that kind of Briar fell off and Prism made its return to the metagame, we kind of saw it fall off again right until after Pro Tour 2, where Prism actually hit Living Legend. And ever since Pro Tour 2, I think Oldhim has been the deck to beat, if not one of the top 3 decks in the format since that point in time. So it's been right up there with one of the most impressive decks, I think, in the game, right along all the other Living Legend heroes like Prism and Chain and Starvo and so forth. So I think it's going to be really interesting heading into the next metagame because it's quite a shakeup going forward in terms of what decks are now allowed, quote unquote, to be played again in a competitive setting.
So that's like, I like the term that you used, oppressive, because there's various different interpretations of what oppressive can be. Because to some, when Chain had seeds and was just unreal in terms of power level, some would have considered that oppressive purely off the fact that it is the power level is so, like exhaustively strong. Same thing with Starvo, etc. Are you saying are you saying oppressive from the fact that it's just inherently the best deck and has been for quite a while? Or are you saying oppressive in the sense that it just shuts down almost every other strategy?
Definitely the latter. So when I say oppressive, I don't really use it the way that, very hyperbolic Twitter people kind of say, like, oh, you have to play this deck or you can't play anything. What I simply mean is that it gatekeeps a lot of the decks out of the format. There are a lot of really interesting, good aggro decks out there that simply can't do more than 14 damage a turn and then therefore get by Oldham's natural ability to just fatigue it, that have really good game into the rest of the metagame, like Bolton being one. So as Oldhim disappears, these decks that were previously gatekept by Oldhim now come to light, and it allows new decks that we previously completely wrote off just because of the existence of Oldhim to re-enter the metagame.
So with Oldhim, was Oldhim out there restraining the meta to a degree and pushing other decks out, or was it more so a deck that was actually keeping things on the rails and actually promoting a certain level of diversity? Because if Oldham's out there just shutting down certain things, then part of that is like, if Oldhim wasn't there, is everything just the most hyper aggressive deck that you could possibly get and becomes a race again?
Yes and no. So it depends really who you ask. The people that play Oldhim and love Oldhim, this will be the coming of the end and everything's doom and gloom and why would you do it? The same kind of mumblings you heard when the Prism people were complaining when Prism got banned. But in reality, there's still other defensive options out there. We still have, Bravo as a hero with a big fridge and the same old good attacks. You still have, defensive Dromai builds. You can still play, defensive Ninja if Flick Flack becomes a thing again. So I think there are tools that exist in the game currently that previously just weren't seeing play because of Oldham's existence, right? Like the Polish players ended up taking Katsu to Worlds. And if you ask them, Oldham's actually probably one of the worst matchups in Katsu's arsenal because of its ability to kind of pivot on a dime to be both aggressive and then defensive once they run him out of threats. So there are a lot of mid-range decks that existed before Oldhim that had really good defensive capabilities that I think we'll see return to the limelight.
So it's just fascinating to me because cards like Vambrace, which a lot of players were saying, well, Vambrace solves a lot of Oldham's problems or perceived problems. And then watching RTN season roll around, and I think one of the heroes that used it the most was actually Oldhim in the mirror, which was just kind of funny to see, where it's like, oh, this is against it, like this is supposed to, like mess with me, but here I am just jamming it in to soak up a mirror match that was already a slog. Let's be real. Ultimately, though, the question now remains: you talked about there are still defensive options out there which lean on Guardian. Are defensive heroes, nobody's going to have the kit, I feel, that Oldhim has. And I think it's going to be a long, long time till you have something along the same ability to just soak as much damage to let the game draw out. But how close is Bravo? You mentioned Bravo as a defensive option, but how close is Bravo?
So I should say that the way Oldhim fatigued 80% of the decks in existence, I don't think is healthy. Like if another hero like Oldhim and another fatigue strategy like Oldhim never came to existence again, I think that's largely a positive thing for the game. Just like I don't believe that Spectra is a necessarily positive interaction. If Spectra's keyword never got printed again, I think that would be an overall positive thing to the game. How Oldhim's kind of became as they evolved was much more of this term that our team uses quite frequently is fatigue by damage. So, and I think this is a very natural gameplay in Flesh and Blood, where you're playing aggressive enough that you force your opponent to block with their threats, and then you kind of make an on-the-fly assessment of, okay, I've run them out of enough threats now that I can simply just block them down until they fatigue. And Guardian being naturally card efficient, right? If you think of, let's say, Briar, for example, in order to get 8 damage worth of 8 points worth of value of damage, you need 2 to 3 cards to go to the graveyard to do that. Where if you're a Guardian player, it only takes like 1 Thunderquake to do 10 points of damage. So every point of damage they're doing is more card efficient than, let's say, an aggro deck. So when you're playing a mid-range Bravo style, if the other aggro decks are tempered and not over the top, you can get to a point where, and you'll see this often in the Bravo versus Lexi matchups, where you'll trade your attacks. They have to block out arrows if it's a Crippling Crusher spot or whatever. And you get to a board state where, they only have 15 cards left in the deck and you can pivot because they don't have enough reds. And that's more, I think, in line of what the game designers want out of Flesh and Blood. They don't want a deck that says, I'm going to block 14 all game, try and kill me. You have 15 turns. Good luck. Have fun. So I do think we will see fatigue as a strategy going forward. I don't think it'll be necessarily as dedicated as we saw Oldhim.
So in that case, like the thing about it, like, and I like what you mentioned here, where you're talking about fatigue through offense, because that in reality, that's what it comes down to. And in fact, it's even a lot more card efficient when you're pitching 2 and sending a 10, like a Thunderquake, and they're throwing 3 cards in front of it. You're net positive 2 cards in that regard. And then you just continue momentum. But isn't that just what normal Flesh and Blood is anyways? Like you attack, they defend, and that's where it goes. Like in a perfect world, the everybody's ideal fatigue strategy would be to send a 10 every turn and buy 3 cards, but that's not always the case. There, where does like this new age fatigue really become something unique? Because I feel like fatigue is almost something that is married to a staunch defensive posture. And when I was watching so many RTN games this past weekend, there were times where, some players had 3 cards, like an Oldhim would have 3 cards in their hand. And rather than like pitch Tunic and send an 8 and maintain an arsenal, they just said, I'm just going to keep 2 cards and throw a hammer anyways. Like it's I feel like if we never get to the point where people find it more valuable to send less damage and preserve a card, like that can't be the right way to move forward with this game.
Yeah, it's a bit of a nuanced discussion because there's a bunch of caveats. One being that the breakpoints of the prominent aggro decks in the metagame not be so over the top that blocking just isn't simply viable. In this metagame, Oldhim specifically, the match Pablo had over the weekend, he was in a spot where any damage done going forward would just be completely counterproductive because he simply could not output as much damage as he needed to kill his opponent over a 20 turn game. So his strategy from whatever point onwards was, I just need to survive until you get down to a handful of cards left in the deck, then maybe I'll start chipping away. But again, this goes back to Oldhim's built that way, especially this metagame's versions of Oldhim, where they're really just trying to get through first cycle and second cycle, and then they'll kind of address it. So in terms of mid-range Flesh and Blood, though, I think you get to see it a lot more in Limited. There's a lot more, limited fatigues that kind of go this way. Even with Assassin, no good Assassin deck just fully blocks out and then swings 1 card for 1 damage. So you kind of see this back and forth trade and then a progression into fatigue later that Uzuri or Arachne was capable of doing.
So this means what particularly for the meta? What opens up? What is essentially, to a degree, winning now that this, now that Oldhim is out of the picture? Now, obviously, we don't know what the new heroes are going to be and what their kit's going to be, but all things, in a vacuum without Dusk Till Dawn involved, Oldhim rotates out. And this is a question that we got from Yuki Lee Bender saying, what are the biggest winners and losers now that Oldhim is gone from the format?
Well, I'm going to give a cheeky answer, say it depends who you ask, right? Because if you ask the Dromai players, they just lost their best matchup. And if you ask the Oldhim players, they are no longer around to prey on the Dromais. So, but in reality, I don't know. I don't have a magic 8-ball, but as it currently stands, I think Oldhim was the only matchup that really gave Lexi a hard time besides Dromai. So I think Lexi stands to gain the most out of this because now it doesn't even have to worry about being fatigued. It can go towards a more elemental or disruptive package. And Lexi already has one of the highest offensive potentials in the game, and it now has the ability to disrupt as well. So, but as Lexi picks up, you're going to see other options like Dromai also pick up, because I think Dromai naturally preys on Lexi as well. So I would say that the other two best decks in the format, the top three being Oldhim, Lexi, and Dromai, probably stand to gain the most out of it going forward. From there, once Lexi, if it's the most predominant deck, I don't know if there's other strategies that were previously being held down by Oldhim that get to come back and make it to the limelight. You could think of Fi maybe, because Fi had quite a good Dromai matchup, and perhaps they could figure out a way, if it doesn't have to be fatigue anymore, to just become a hyper aggressive deck and go over the top of Lexi. But it's going to take some testing, and you're absolutely right with Dusk Till Dawn. This might be a question not worth answering until we get into spoiler season, but I think it opens up a lot of decks that we don't even consider right now. Like maybe a mid-range defensive Katsu, Flick Flax become really good, right? Because being able to block for 4 and then potentially fire on versus Lexi is huge, and then returning Serbu Kadachi could be really good. So we'll see going forward, but those are my predictions for now.
Yeah, that's probably one of the bigger things to be scared of, is the fact that Ninja Turtle coming back and going down to like a Kadachi lock or whatnot. One of the funniest things was suiting up for casting one of the Oldhim like top 8s or something. The mic was picking up, or the camera was also had a microphone and was picking up some of the conversations, and it was an Oldhim mirror, and they're like, "How many cards you running?" They're like, 73. You 72, and they're like, okay, like it was gonna be a while, but actually those matches finished up fairly quickly. I say quickly, fairly quickly, like within 50 minutes, which was a surprise. Nathan Crawford actually was asking about Lexi, and is it going to be a little too strong due to the fact that, and I quote, due to the lack of opportunity cost paid by adding a heavy ice package in the sideboard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That was my first instinct too when Oldhim got banned, because going into the Pro Tour, one of my options, or one of the decks I closely looked at, was Ice Disruption Lexi, because if you got to play more ice cards, you had a better mirror match and a better anti-aggro package than just the Fuseless version. But the one downside to playing more elemental cards is that you become much weaker against fatigue. So it was this kind of delicate balance, and we saw that out of a number of people, myself included, where we would sideboard certain ice cards for the mirror match, but we would never be a fully dedicated elemental build like we saw Yuki take to Pro Tour 1 with the Insidious Chills and Blizzard Bolts and what have you. So I think Nathan has a good point that what was already a bad matchup for other aggro decks like Briar can become even worse now that they're able to play a full elemental package without any kind of downside. With that being said, Bravo still exists, so I'm fairly certain a Bravo deck is able to fatigue an elemental Lexi, because if you can only shoot 2 arrows a turn, you're looking at about 10 to 12 damage, and I think that is very reasonable for Bravo to beat. But we'll have to see how it shakes up. I should also note that the elemental version of Lexi is also worse against Dromai. So there are natural predators. We'll have to see how it plays out going forward.
Well, that was what I was thinking, because the first thing that I immediately pivoted to, because I don't really feel like learning something new, is I just figured like let's just pick up some pick up Bravo, and if you're just rolling crush effects that would affect either what's in the hand or what she's capable of doing, things like crush confidence, you can't flip a card over, things like chokeslam are not necessarily the best. They're not there to necessarily hunt, but they do help to a degree. But ultimately, is Bravo the best remedy for Lexi's?
I don't know. It's it's a deck I tried a lot, and the unfortunate thing with Bravo, even though it has a very strong kit, being able to start with 52 life between your equipment if you wanted to is a huge deal. But there are times where you just simply stumble, and then Lexi kind of gets the front foot, and then you kind of lose from there. I think Bravo's very good, and it has a very similar matchup spread to Oldhim. So it's an interesting deck that I'm going to look at a little bit closer now that Oldhim is no longer an option. But I don't know if Remedy is the word I'd use. I think Lexi is still a very, very powerful deck, but there are other options out there that you can use to beat Lexi. Like Azalea comes to mind as well. Without Oldhim, Azalea kind of now rises up as well, even though it still has a bad Dromai matchup. So I don't know if there's going to be one option to kind of just play into every deck. I think we're going to see much more metagame shifts. So if week one everybody's on Lexi, you might see a winner's metagame full of Azalea and Dromai. And then if Azalea and Dromai do really well, then you might see, Bravo would then shine. It would kind of be like a week 3 type deal. And that's where kind of I see Bravo slotting into the metagame. I don't necessarily think it's going to be the deck that takes Lexi down. I think that's going to be more Azalea and Dromai, and then Bravo will kind of slot into that aspect. Same with like Viserai and some of the other decks we've seen around in the metagame.
So this leads us to the poll of the week, which was the question asked, with Oldhim gone, what style will dominate competitive classic constructed metas? The leader was aggro with 67%, followed by mid-range at about 24%, combo 6%, and then control/fatigue lagging way behind at about 3.5%. So the majority, just like 2/3 of the respondents, saying it's going to be an aggro fest, and it's that definitely leans towards Lexi. But is it even worth trying something like Fi or bringing Fi back? Or Briar was for the longest time just top of the mountain because you had these massive explosive turns, but is the relative consistency of Lexi's output versus these like miracle, draw 2-3 cards, channel mount heroic turns with Briar, let's say, or Fi's just consistent pestering you with these 3 or 4 go agains over and over and over again? Do those hold a candle anywhere close to Lexi's potential?
Yes, I played a lot of Briar going into Pro Tour 3, I guess it was called. I talked to Hayden Dale, who was also kind of champion of the deck going forward. Ultimately, I decided to kind of put it down because even though it had the same type of damage output as Lexi, it lacked kind of the disruptive elements that Lexi was able to present. So even though Briar was able to have a full armor kit where Lexi doesn't, if Lexi was able to get a good disruption turn off, it could sometimes be worth 8 or 9 damage by itself. And of course, each 3 of a kind was worth 6 points of damage. And then you get the really high roll potential of, Lexi, Rain Razor turns. That isn't to say that other aggro decks won't be in the format, but I think they will need to be reimagined. I think Flesh and Blood, like every other card game, will always have a type of best deck, and whatever deck that isn't the best deck will have to kind of reimagine itself in order to be fit and played in the metagame. We saw that from Team Covenants or the Wolfpack, Zach Bunn, who topped for the Calling, I believe, with Viserai, a deck that I previously had completely written off. And his list was very unique to some of the Viserai decks we've seen recently. So I do think other aggro decks can exist in the metagame, but you definitely have to approach it from a completely different way. You can't be doing the same thing over and over again and expecting it to work.
All right, so that leads us to what Dusk Till Dawn could possibly present. And traditionally, it has been a world where, like you mentioned, illusionists are kind of out there policing the guardians, as it were, and such. Do you think that any kind of future Guardian play is this a well-timed living legend because he was probably never going to be relevant once a new illusionist kind of, another illusionist hero rolls back in and maybe makes old school auras relevant again? Do you think that the timing on this might have just been too perfect?
I mean, it might be serendipitous for sure. Maybe it was about to become unplayable because Genesis and, haze bending were about to re-enter the metagame, like you said. But I've been an advocate that I kind of wanted, even though I had a lot of success on Oldhim, I've wanted the hero to go for a while now. I do think it puts a big kind of foot around the neck of the metagame where if you wanted to play fun and creative decks like Radiant Bolton or Dorinthia, you just simply couldn't do it anymore because Oldhim existed. Like Dorinthia, I think will be fully unleashed going forward, and it's a deck that I have as probably the most potential to have a good tournament now that Oldhim isn't there. Because I think it also has the defensive tools to beat Lexi while also having, the ramping up offensive potential to be able to outpace Lexi. So I'm excited to see where the metagame goes without Oldhim's foot around its neck.
Yeah, part of why I'm not too happy about Dorinthia coming back is twofold. Number one, it makes for the most awkward games to play, and it's a hero I have absolutely zero reps on, and casting those matches is going to be an absolute freaking nightmare. Like, it's just okay, one float plus 3. Like, that's basically kind of the thought process there. But ultimately, we'll see moving forward. But I think that's a very it's not an outlandish thing to think that is what's going to happen. That Dorinthia players might actually have a little pocket of the meta that they can maybe, or at least a pocket of time that they can actually be worthwhile. But again, we don't know what Dusk Till Dawn will bring. That's a question for down the line, and I don't even care enough to speculate on that stuff. Because they printed the weapon and everybody lost their shit. It's like, this is garbage. It's like, you don't know anything. You have no clue what's coming out. But we've got a juicier nugget to nibble on, buddy, which is there was a video that was put out by, and I completely forgot who that individual was, and I apologize, but it was basically kind of an examination of barrier to entry from a point of cost. What does it cost to be competitive in a game? And Flesh and Blood was by and far the most expensive. You saw the video, you also talked about it, and there was also, tweets that were put out that were like, yeah, Flesh and Blood is ridiculous. It's this, it's that, it's whatever. And you actually responded with a little bit more analysis of the data and why it was flawed. So can you talk a little bit about what that data was and the flaws or the blemishes that you found in the analysis?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So it was a good video overall, and it was entertaining, right? As a purely content creator point of view, I think it did its job. I mean, look at all the discourse it created. And I think that's kind of your dream when you make a video like that, where, you have thousands of people from 5 different big games all kind of commentating their point of it. So the video was good, and it got people's attention, which I guess it was his point. But I think this is a big lesson in statistical analysis and kind of where kind of just taking data and interpreting it can really go very wrong and give people kind of the justifications they need to throw shade or maybe defend their convictions that may not be right. So what this individual did was they took the 5 most prevalent decks in each kind of game category, and then they compared its price points using a TCG low method, and then they accounted for redundancies by removing crossover cards between decks. So overall, not too bad. And it was interesting because in other games, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon and Magic, a lot of these games kind of function the same, where cards don't really interchange, and there's much less interchange and overlap between decks. So it was an okay way of comparing 3 different games. Where it kind of falls short is that in Flesh and Blood, each hero is defined pretty much by a unique set of cards, and that card pool is very small, and it kind of slots into every other deck of that genre. So when we think of Guardian, for example, You're thinking of, I don't know, spinal crushes or I don't know, tectonic plating or Rampart's Ram's Head or whatever, maybe Crater Fist, for example. So if you own those cards, you can play it in either Bravo or Oldhim, and then will cumulate or it'll take up the majority cost of building either of those decks. So when this individual made the video, when he took the top 5 decks in Flesh and Blood, which I also don't believe he got the top 5 decks correct, because he chose Icelander. I don't think Icelander is a tier 1 deck right now. But anyways, um, he took basically 5 different archetypes and then priced it out and said, well, here you go. The problem with that, though, is that there's only 10 classes in Flesh and Blood. You know, we talk about Wizard, Runeblade, Guardians, etc. You only have 10 classes of heroes. So if you buy all the major key cards for the 5 decks in the game, you've not only bought the 5 best decks in the metagame as defined by this individual, you've also bought 5 out of the 10 archetypes that exist in the entire game. That's like buying almost half the entire card pool. So in that regards, you know, he looked at buying a much larger card pool in Flesh and Blood relative to Magic the Gathering and Pokemon. And then furthermore, Flesh and Blood itself is kind of a living legend. Sorry, I should say eternal format game where if you get a card in alpha and then get a card, you know, today, all those cards are legal to play in whatever metagame or, you know, tournament structure there is. Where in another game like Magic the Gathering, there's multiple formats. There's standard formats, which is, you know, the last 2-3 years of cards, and there's eternal formats like Modern and Legacy. And rather than comparing like a Modern or a Legacy deck in Magic, that individual ended up comparing a standard deck, which is much shorter period of time and less applicable to a direct comparison.
That's part of it. It's like, and it's a very difficult thing to break down because of things like formats and, you know, the fact that cards can kind of, they're, you know, quote unquote eternal. You know, you have a Tunic, which is usually the nucleus of this kind of discussion. Everybody goes back to the fact that a Tunic is expensive. Yeah, a Tunic's expensive. It's the best card in the game. Like, it is legitimately, arguably the best card in the game. It should be expensive. It is also probably, it's in the rarest tier of the entire game. It's also been reprinted twice. And I don't, like, this is the part that kind of confuses me, where people will, you know, stir shit about this kind of stuff and price points, wherein you're not factoring in all the variables, and you're also discounting the fact that good cards should be good and they should, you know, be rare or whatnot. And I don't know, it was just like this gigantic maelstrom of honest to God, like, just the amount of time, like the replies, like on both sides of the argument, like there were Flesh and Blood people and, you know, the other side of the coin, like Magic people, other card game people who were just having this conversation. And as silly as it may seem to some, you know, you're listening to this and neither side fully understands each other. So like, it's like one person arguing balls and strikes and the other one's arguing an offside. You know, it's like you're not in the same. You're in sports. You got the genre. You just got the fucking specifics wrong, and that can be kind of weird. It was just funny because these kinds of arguments have been bubbling up for a long time. But you know, like if I want to go pick up a standard deck, it's not going to cost me as much as if I wanted to pick up a tier 1, let's say. If you want to play Oldhim at its height, that's an expensive deck to play for sure. But you can't equate, you know, classic constructed format to standard and say that that's a fair assessment. Because if I want to go play Pioneer or Modern and I want to go win a tournament, I'm going to be down 5 Gs, let alone, you know, maybe $1,000 for a top tier deck.
Yeah, and it's the reason I wasn't even going to kind of talk about it, because I'd seen some people kind of posting and tweeting about it a couple of days before. And I hate kind of having disinformation discussions because it always just ends up where somebody sticks by their dogma and isn't really arguing in good faith. And we saw that with the Boohooglin tweet, where he kind of just goes off on a rant for no particular reason and is just so misinformed that I'm like, okay, well, now I kind of have to do it because he's kind of a moron with a large following. So I kind of have to address it. But You're absolutely right. Like in a lot of senses, they were comparing apples to oranges, and when you do that, you don't really see kind of the full picture. It also raises an interesting point where it's like, yes, Flesh and Blood, if you want to buy an Eternal deck, can be pricey depending on which hero you're choosing. But if you're comparing the same metrics between every card game, they're all relatively high, right? If I tell you tomorrow, Flake, we're going to a modern, 10K put on by Face to Face Games, a local game store in Toronto, for those of you that don't know, we're going to play modern. What do you think the price point for a competitive quote unquote modern deck would be if you had to guess?
And this is the fun part about this, because I started to do this because I wanted to actually get into outside of standard, but into Magic. And the first card I think I looked up was like, a polluted Delta. Like, I like these colors. How much is a polluted Delta? And they're like, what, like $50 or $60 a piece? I could be wrong. I'm not sure, but that was just for 4 lands. That's for resource management. So then, yeah, like that was I couldn't even fathom. I said that, like, if you want, you said modern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm going to guess that if I want like a tier 1 modern list, I'll say even on the lower end, I'm looking at probably about 3 Gs.
That's a bit high. I think it's about $1,000, give or take, depending on where you want to go. Maybe $1,000 to $2,000. Some of the more expensive decks can be pushing $3,000, but my point being is that it pushes the basically $1,000 to $2,000 price range if you want to play kind of the lowest rarity and still have one of the best decks like Blue Red Murktide, 4-color Elementals, Black Red Scam, et cetera, et cetera. But people talk about barrier of entry. It's like you don't need to have a full power deck to kind of show up to your local game store and still have fun. And that's where I kind of did my poll as to what really defines people's opinion of what a barrier of entry is. And I think the results of that was pretty interesting. There are some people that said, yeah, winning like a pro level tournament or 50K is my level of entry. But the vast majority said, I want to just be competitive. My low. And I think for less than $100, you could easily build a Flesh and Blood deck that could go 4-0 at your local Armory event next week. Whereas in Magic, same kind of idea. If you wanted to build a modern deck for less than $100, there's probably a deck you could play that would give you a shot at 4-0ing. But if you were going to a professional event or a 50K, there's no deck in the world that would give you that kind of chance of winning if you're not spending close to $1,000 or more.
So that's what I want to touch on, because I think that there's definitely merit in the sense of thinking when it comes to barrier of entry, because I answered that poll. I think what I said was like, I don't know I forgot what the tier was, but it was something like top 8ing. Was it like top 8ing in RTN was one of the options, or a PQ level event or something? Mm-hmm. To me, I'm like, if I'm going to invest or look to invest in a game, that's the level of success that I would like to see or attain. And then therefore, what is the money I would need, or what are the decks that I would need to attain that? To me, I think that is something you can do. Maybe not at Hairy Tarantula. You can't just bring your own personal jank and expect to win. But, there are pockets of the meta around the world where you can go in and show up with like an Arachne or something else and go ahead and win off of your own kind of secret spice. But what I think in merits discussion is, the argument that I've seen thrown around on both sides, and you basically framed this nicely, is you can go ahead and compete for a low level price. But what people might be forgetting is that they don't want to do that. People are not getting into a game and saying like, I want to compete but I don't want to exceed second gear. Like most people who, when they talk about barrier of entry, they want to get in and also succeed. Nobody wants to get into something and get their ass kicked over and over and over again. And you're talking, and I know you know this, but you're talking to somebody who has played enough Halo in their life where if I didn't start improving and getting good at it, I would probably stop playing that freaking game. Or if I wasn't having as much fun with my buddies being idiots in that game. But this is card gaming. This is different. It's a one-on-one. There's a winner and a loser that you work towards. So the barrier of entry discussion that says, you could play at an event and, probably do okay for $100. It's true. That's objectively true. But why would you want to do that? It's like, okay, you could win a Halo match using just the assault rifle, But if a BR costs $50, you're probably going to buy it because it's going to enhance and increase so many other experiences down the line.
What makes this discussion even funnier to me is that if you want to just play at a local level, you could do it on a super friendly budget. But the people that complain about it and also go to tournaments make no sense because nobody plays TCGs to make money. Like, we all just acknowledge up front that this is going to be a money sink, right? This is, in fact, a luxury hobby to some extent where you have to sink a significant amount of money in just traveling, right? You think of travel, hotel, flights, food while you're away, like you're losing hundreds, if not $1,000, depending on your comfort level, to just go to these tournaments to begin with. So barrier of entry at a competitive level is already super high before we even talk about what's going in your deck box. So to me, it's like, if you're talking about barrier of entry and you want to play at a casual competitive level, you can hit me up. I'll give you a deck worth $50 that will 4-0 easily your RTN next week. In fact, you just gave me a good idea for a new article series. So there you go. I'll be balling on a budget and I'll write 3 decks or something.
Please mention in it that this idea spawned during. I need as much free advertisement as possible. Okay.
For sure. So the point is, though, is like, if you're going to complain about barrier of entry, I don't want to see you staying at the Hyatt paying $400 a night for your own king suite, because it's like, come on now. And I mean, like, every other game is basically the exact same model, right? You buy booster packs, you have a chance of getting a rare card. You want that rare card to be worth money, because nothing is less fun than opening $100 worth of booster packs and only getting $20 back out of it. So it's a fine balance, because if it's too much the other direction, you have people complaining that their cards are devalued and you basically become a CCG instead of a TCG. So I don't know. I think people were looking for reasons to kind of throw shade. We've seen that throughout Flesh and Blood's history already. And I think this video kind of gave them a very low-hanging fruit to kind of latch on to and go, this is why I'm not doing it, or this is why I'm not playing Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, and that's part of the reality of it as well, is like, dude, like, if we're in this discussion, we could afford it. And if, and like, that's not to say that it's not expensive, because it is. And I think that, like, you can't escape the fact that if you want to go and see success in the game with as little friction and resistance as possible, because like you said, you can go ahead and slam down $50 and make a deck. And if you practice with it and you're good enough, you could probably 4-0 an Armory or even top 8 an RTN with like some janky, cheap, inexpensive stuff. But that's not what people are looking to do. But at the same time, if you're looking to get into it or you're already into it, you could probably afford it. And, whether that's right or wrong is a whole other discussion. But there's this weird balance that I've always found fascinating, which is the collector investment aspect of card games, where, some people are going to bitch and whine about reprints because it destroys their value. Like the same people who are bitching about the price of Flesh and Blood probably some of them are also, they are ingrained in a game that has a reserve list that is purely there to jerk off investors. Like, that's kind of what it's about, right? It's like, we're never reprinting these cards, or we're never going to do it again because it might they're very powerful cards to begin with, but ultimately it's still a matter of, there's investors who bought these things or who own these things, and if we reprint them, it just kills the value of this secondary economy. But as a player on my end, when I get like a super rare card or a chase card or whatever, I immediately sell it because I have no interest in that. So I don't quite understand where people give the same amount of respect and credence to the collector side of a card game discussion or community, where decisions might be made from the design standpoint or from like the company standpoint, from the printing standpoint, to appease or protect investments in that regard. Like, as if it was up to me, I'd say, like, fuck it, I don't care. Go reprint Command and Conquer again, reprint Tunic again, downgrade it to a Majestic, do whatever the hell you want so there's people in there. But that is going to be met with the same kind of thing, because if the prices go too low, then people lose their fucking minds as well. And so it's such a nightmare thing where, like, ultimately, what is this? Is it a card game? Is it stocks? Like, what is this?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far to say it was stocks or anything, but at the end of the day, a card game company primary focus, whether it's Wizards of the Coast, Legend Story Studios, whatever, is to primarily make money, and they want to appease both their competitive crowd and their players, as well as the whales in the community. Right? Magic's doing it too. You have serialized numbers on really random chase rares. You have secret layers up the wazoo. You have proxy packs selling for $1,000 a pop. Flesh and Blood has fables and they have chase cards, but nowhere near to the same degree as anything else. So to say, use the word loot box, which I heard Boo Hoogland use and a couple other people, I think that's kind of ridiculous, especially when I think Boo Hoogland champions like Marvel Snap and these like mobile games that are literally just money grabs without any kind of replayability, in my opinion. But I digress at this point. I can kind of rant on this for a while. At the end of the day, we're all playing this luxury hobby. We all kind of choose at what kind of level we want to play at, whether it be casual, competitive, or collector. And each one has their different price point of entry. And if you think that the competitive price point of entry in this game is too high, I think that's just a factually incorrect statement if you compare it to any of the other TCGs out there fairly. But more power to you. You can play Flesh and Blood casually for very cheap. You can play Magic casually for very cheap. But the sky's the limit in terms of how much money you actually want to pay.
So let me ask you this then, like just to wrap up this last part. And as a side note, the whole loot box thing actually kind of made me laugh because I thought it was actually quite out of touch, given the fact that in reality, any booster pack you open is kind of like a mini loot box to that degree. But Marvel Snap is actually, it's a collector box or a collector box, whatever it's called, where you could get you're probably not getting a card. You cannot access probably any of the cards you want. If you want to build a deck today and you spend $1,000, you're not getting the deck you want. You're not. It's just if you start today, if you play that game today and you sink $1,000 or $2,000 into the game, there's a very good chance that you cannot build the specific deck that you had in mind. You have to get lucky. You have to open the right stuff, get the collector tokens, and hope that they show up in the shop and whatever. Like, but to me, I don't care because if you're playing it and you want that, you're okay with paying for it. If you don't like it, it's not. It just makes me laugh that people will call, a booster pack system with high rarity cards a loot box, but not everything else a loot box. So this kind of leads me to the last part I want to talk about this, which is what to you is the adequate price point for somebody to get into this game and basically have a write a check and say, I'm spending this much dollars, go buy me a tier 1 deck. What is that price point? Like, what's the right balance? Because to me, I don't think it's $1,000 to $1,200 to have an Oldhim deck that has 10 legendary equipment in its sideboard. But at the same point, if it's just like $100, $150, I think that the game is probably failing to that degree.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I'm young enough that I still remember what it was like being in college and being broke and still trying to play a TCG competitively. For me personally, I think $400 to $500 is probably the sweet spot for decks. Flesh and Blood is hard in that way because, like we talked about already, when you're spending that $1,000 to build Oldhim, you're not just building Oldhim. You probably have already 95% of Bravo if you wanted to just port it over. Or any other kind of Guardian heroes in the future, like any of the Blitz Guardian decks. So it's hard because Flesh and Blood is very unique that when you buy into one hero, you're pretty much buying into 90% of its class. But for me, or what it was like as a poor college student, I think $500 was a fair point because you want it expensive enough that when you win certain cards for certain decks, you can then kind of trade them for money and then buy cards that you want. There is a reward system that ties into tournaments. When you get store credit or booster packs, you want to be able to pull money out of them. So like you said, I don't think $100 price point is right because that would mean every card you pull from a booster pack is essentially worth close to nothing. But I also agree that $1,000 might be a little prohibitive. So I think somewhere in the middle, around $500 would be nice. And in Magic, it was really nice because of Magic Online. For a pro college student, you could kind of play Tickets used to be almost, worth the entire dollar, and booster packs used to be worth quite a bit, which you won in dailies. And you can kind of build your collection from online into paper, and then from there, from paper, I went to my LGS and won store credit. And that's how I kind of built my collection up personally over time, was able to pay even for my travel expenses. So, we'll see as Flesh and Blood get bigger. I'm sure their economy will be more flush. LSS is still relatively new, so I think they understand this. I would be shocked if they didn't see the drama that happened last week, and I'm sure they're going to make changes over time. And if they think the price point is too high, we'll see cards come down. We've already seen reprints with the foreign sets and the white border sets going forward.
So, that's the way that I sort of envision this, is like getting into Flesh and Blood is like putting your down payment on your house. Like, it's a huge chunk. You want to put 5, 10, 20% or whatever, but then you got to pay the mortgage to keep up with it. But the mortgage payments are going to be significantly less than that big chunk you slam down on that house initially. But you're living in it, and like it's yours, and it'll always be there. Will it need repair? Will it need maintenance? Sure. But ultimately, that barrier of entry, like that first burst of expenditure, that first bill that you have to pay to get in and feel adequate or feel competitive. Yeah, it's pretty scary. But like you said, like once you're in, and then you're just kind of paying the maintenance fee of every time a set comes in. And I would even argue, if you're not addicted to ripping packs and opening stuff and chasing that feeling, you could probably, once you sort of slam down that first and major investment into the game, buying the key pieces and the staples, the Command and Conquers, the tunics, whatever, once you're beyond that and new sets come out, once you're caught up and new sets come out, like, for example, Outsiders came out, and if you don't care about everything owning the set, you could just pick and choose and say, hey, I spent like $55-$60 to get these 4 common, or the playset of these commons I needed, 3 Codex of Frailties, and 3 Down and Dirties. And then I walked to it, and then that was it. And ultimately, that's not a huge investment, but people don't kind of factor that in, and I don't blame them. And I think that it's just a reality, because every time a new set comes in, you just buy a case and you open it and you hope to find that chase rare that you either keep or you sell to pay for your shit. And that's how it goes.
So funny enough, that's just me. A lot of people don't know this, but before the Pro Tour, I simply just bought my entire Lexi deck from Hamal for I think like $250 or $300. It wasn't just my Lexi deck, but it was like my Lexi deck plus every Majestic in the set cost me $250 or something like that, just because I already owned, like you said, the big generics going into it, aka the Tunic and the Command and Conquer. So in my opinion, it's fairly cheap once you
where's the
make
fun
that first. Yeah, I think it's fun.
I know, like it's just. I think to a degree have finally sort of matured to myself where I can live in a room with sealed cases of cards next to me and not have the urge to just actually tear them in half like this, like a second ago. This was not the case. As far back as like maybe five years ago, if I was in a room with sealed product, like forget it. It was just torn to shreds. And then realizing at the end, I'm like, why did I do that? There's nothing in here I need. Like that dopamine hit is just completely dissipated by now, and I'm left wallowing. I felt like I like de-hulked. I'm like, what the hell just happened? Like, I know some shit went down. I have no clue. My clothes are torn up. I have no idea what happened, but there's a mess on the floor, and I do not feel happy. Let's talk briefly before we wrap it up for this episode about competitive structure in Flesh and Blood, because that was something that everybody had a little bit of an opinion on, but who better to ask than somebody who's knee deep in it, 2-time national champion, competed at Worlds, Pro Tours, all this other stuff. Tariq, is the current structure for competitive Flesh and Blood correct? As in, we went from 2 Pro Tours down to 1. We've got our national championship and a Worlds. What does it look like? What do you want to see this competitive structure look like perhaps next year if there's a revision?
I think in general, it's doing all the right things. I think the system they have in place where ProQuest kind of feed Pro Tours and just keeping it simple and having haulings every couple of months is nice. I think they could work on the timing a little bit. It'd be nicer to have, a big premier event happening every 2 to 3 months on average, without big breaks in between, right? We just came off a Pro Tour at the beginning of April, I believe. And now in North America, I don't think we have a premier event until Nationals. So there's like almost like a 5-6 months gap. And that kind of sucks. But I think everybody's just excited to play. And all I want as a player are more opportunities. For me personally, I think Worlds kind of feels too close to a Pro Tour for me. What I would like to see is, 2 to 3 Pro Tours a year and then 1 Worlds a year, and tie it into Nationals, where the top X people of every Nationals qualify for a Worlds event. You can do top 8, top 4, whatever it may be, and then it becomes a little bit more of an exclusive. If you have 50 countries with 4 people each, then that's 200-ish people, but it becomes a more country-based event. Because to me, growing up with TCGs, I played Yu-Gi-Oh, I played Magic. Nationals and World always felt different than the Pro Tours in the sense that you were playing for your country. So Nationals, I believe, should be more of an open thing. I don't even think RTN seasons are needed. Just make it an open tournament where everybody in the country competes and you get to crown a national champion. I think Nationals is a cool enough concept where you get to say you're the best player in your country without having, to qualify already for it. So if it was up to me, I kind of would just remove the barrier of entry to RTNs or increase the amount of RTNs. Instead of 1 3-week RTN season, I would do 4 or 5 RTN seasons, kind of spread out through the year. So it makes it really easy for people to kind of qualify. And then from there, tie Worlds into Nationals, where you get to see everybody's country's best of the best compete for that world champion title. And then that individual company, or country, I should say, gets bragging rights for the year. That's how I would personally do it. The biggest change, I think the tournament series like RTNs and ProQuest seasons are too short. And I think Toronto's a big one that is suffering from that right now, because there's only 3 weeks of RTNs happening. And during one of those weeks, I believe it's this week in Flake, is Anime North. And as you living here, you've seen what that's all about. But essentially, no local game store in the area has the resources to run an RTN simultaneously as Anime North, because they've sent the majority of their staff over to kind of vend the event or buy product or whatever it is. So in Toronto, it's been really hard because there's 3 weeks of RTN. 1 week is just gone because the stores aren't running events. So it leaves stores with 2 weeks to run events. And then if you have something happening, like I do, I'm going to be out of the country for the 3rd week of the RTN. It kind of only gave me 1 bullet to qualify for Nationals this year. So I think spreading it out or making the season a little bit longer would be nice, or just kind of removing it completely and making Nationals open would be good. But at the same time, I get LSS's desire to incentivize local play. So I'm fine with RTNs and ProQuest. Just kind of give us a little bit more opportunities.
Did you have your RTN yet?
I did, and I got there.
I was going to ask you, yeah. Because that would be that, and that leads to my next question, actually, which is this whole conversation about should defending national champions just have an automatic entry into the national championship? And to me, it seems like an absolute no-brainer. You're good enough last year. You should have. It's like, why is Mike Weir playing at the Masters? Like, the guy sucks, but he's invited because he won, and that's just part of the rules. It's part of the allure of it. It's you are immortalized in that regard. I'm not here saying that you should be invited to every nationals until they stop running them, but the defending champion should be allowed in. Listen, what would happen if you didn't get there with your RTN and you didn't acquire an invite somehow or whatnot, and you were just iced out of it? You're like, while everyone else is competing, you're there at whatever hotel lobby that you're playing in, running an outsiders draft, watching while everyone else is playing like CC. Like, do you feel like this is just should be a gimme? Like, just let them in?
I mean, I'm obviously going to be biased, so I'm going to say yes. Of course, I think the national champions should be invited back to defend their title the next season. But past that, I can speak a little bit more. This is anecdotal, of course, but it creates a lot of feel-bad scenarios too. Because for every spot that I'm playing in for an RTN, I'm taking it away from somebody else. And I can tell you, because I only had 1 weekend, I had 2 RTNs, one at Chimera, one at Harry T. And I had to dream crush a lot of people that really wanted their spot at Nationals. And I could see it when I beat them, that they weren't happy that they lost. I don't think they were necessarily happy that they had to play me. Some may argue, well, if you want to play at nationals, you have to beat, the best players in the room. But at the same time, you want these people to be able to get there and compete at nationals. You don't want them falling short at an LGS level. So even past my own kind of biased point of view, where yes, I think I should have had an invite, it really sucks for certain people that didn't make it. And I'm going to tell a story now about Joel, because I had to beat him in the top 8 draft of the Harry T1 to qualify. And it has this kind of snowballing effect, because I think he was planning on going to, I think it's the Realm Games that's holding an event this weekend in Pittsburgh. He was thinking about going to that, but now likely has to skip in order to drive all the way down to Barrie to play an RTN. So not only did this affect his tournament that weekend, but it's affecting the Realm Games. Now is getting one less player. And so it has kind of cascading effects as well, that I don't believe are necessarily positive. But that's just my opinion on it. And I'll let the smarter heads figure that one out.
Yeah, well, like the thing about it is, like, legitimately, if you had to imagine you're just like loading up the game and the first, like, you choose Liu Kang and the first dude you have to fight is Goro. You're like, well, come on, man. Like let me learn the game and like get a little bit of like there's a final boss for a reason. And I totally get it where, it's not like you're getting to nationals and they're not giving you like 3 free buys. Like you're not an automatic day 2 or whatever the hell it is. You still have to work for it. You still have to grind. You still have to actually win those matches. But I feel like I see the cascading effect. I get it. You're just the one person. But if you didn't win this time, I'm sure you would have knocked out a couple people from a top 8 contention that were, aggressively pursuing it. I've been to tournaments where I've seen, I'm like, this dude has like 5 of them. You've already won 5 RTNs this season. Like, what are you doing? And, at the same time, I've seen the panic in certain people's eyes where like they have this little play group, these awesome dudes from Montreal that were in a couple RTN seasons ago or ProQuest seasons ago that came here, and they're like, 3 of the 4 of us have it. And we've all agreed to basically concede this person up if we have to face them. But this is somebody who I ended up like playing against, and it was like, they were like, so I was like, let's just split. You can have the thing. I'll have the gold foil. Like, we'll move along. Like, I don't want to ruin anyone's day. I'm not playing in it anyways. Like, so let's just move along. But you're right. Like, if there was just a free pass into it, it just makes sense to me. Like, bring the champ back. Nobody wants to see you playing Shapeshifter Sealed, jamming some pizza in your face while you're watching everybody else like lose their minds. So, I'm glad. So I got two last little points here that we can just touch upon briefly here, which is, you actually mentioned it, which is the Realm Circuit, the Pittsburgh Brawl. I want you to just maybe comment on the emergence of these like third-party circuits, these tournaments and such, because we went through this patch where people were like, what, we don't know what tournaments are happening. Like, this was probably like Q4 last year, Q1 this year, where people had no freaking clue what was coming down the pipe. And then that kind of torch was picked up by people like Realm Games, MinMax, Green Tree Sports, that have said, you know what, screw it. Like, we'll work with them, we'll work with LSMS as much as they want to, but we're just going to do our own thing because there's clearly a demand for this. And just today being Tuesday, the 23rd of May, Realm Games just announced that they're not only doing the same thing next year, but their prize pool is going from $20,000 to $50,000. So clearly this is not just a success. It's a big enough success that they can, more than double their investment into it.
Yeah, I think these standalone circuits are a really good thing for the game. I think, like I said earlier, the lull between major events are too big, and these kind of supplemental things give people incentive to kind of train towards, to practice towards, to continue showing up to the LGSs. So I think it's a really good thing. In terms of the one in Pittsburgh, I already know the majority of Canadians are going. There's going to be a Canadian invasion for sure happening in Pittsburgh. So, and this wouldn't have happened otherwise, right? I don't know if a lot of the Canadians would be practicing as much as they are now if Pittsburgh wasn't happening, if Real Games weren't putting this on. So I think it keeps the local game store economy going. It keeps interest in the game. And it honestly is enticing. You know, I've started looking into it myself. I might be competing in 2024. I'm on the fence about going to Pittsburgh because it's kind of last minute and I have to figure out who's going to take care of my dogs. But if I can get out there, I might get out there myself. So, but I think Isaac, Dilks, James, Joel, well, maybe not Joel anymore for the reasons I just mentioned, but Jasker, I think all the big Canadian names from the East Coast are heading down to Pittsburgh this weekend. So I think it's a really good thing, and I wish them all the best, and I hope it takes off.
So last bit now. You and I, fiercely Canadian, we're very proud. You know, there's a lot of great players up here. You just named a whole bunch of them. Have we kind of lost a little bit of our step here? Is the swagger worn off? Because, you know, a year ago, it's hard to argue that Canada wasn't one of the pound for pound most powerful or scary countries when it came to flesh and blood. Poland's out there, obviously, Australia, New Zealand, whatever. But it feels like there's just been this missed step for a little bit.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I mean, going back to even the last North American calling had 3 Canadians in the top 8. Do you think about it as like we were 5% of the room? It was like a 900-person tournament. We were like maybe 20 Canadians there. We put 3 in the top 8. And then at Worlds, we had Jasker coming 10th. I lost my winning in. Did I say Worlds or Pro Tour? Whatever, the Pro Tour in Baltimore that just happened.
Yeah.
You know, we had 2 Canadians basically just lose their winning in, and Jasker missing on breakers. So I wouldn't necessarily say that at all. I mean, we're obviously a smaller country compared to America, much less representation in an open field, but I think we're doing all right for ourselves. I don't think anybody necessarily wants to play Canadian when they're at a Battle Hardened event or a calling. So we'll see this weekend in Pittsburgh. We'll see how the Canadians do, and then maybe you can ask me that question again in private.
We should do like a U.S. versus Canada series. I think that would be actually pretty cool. Like this weird like Summit Series stuff, but that'd be pretty rad.
Yeah, like a Ryder Cup thing.
Yeah, oh, that would be so cool. I like that. I'm all for that. So Tariq, thank you so much again. As always, you're always like so gung-ho and ready to rock and roll when it comes to like doing the show, and your voice is one that is very respected but also very candid and just no bullshit, which I think a lot of people also are appreciative of, me specifically. You know, and so thanks for doing the show. Where can people get more of your musings and your thoughts?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I always have a fun time talking with you, Flake. You can follow me at Tariq Patel 10 on Twitter. I write on Channel Fireball as well. If you just Google Tariq Patel, Channel Fireball, Flesh and Blood, I should pop up. So channelfireball.com for my articles and Twitter for my musings.
Beauty. All right. So we are going to do our Go Again segment, which is a Patreon exclusive. So if you haven't signed up, go to patreon.com/instantspeedpod and you'll get access to the next segment, which is going to be Go Again, uncensored, unhinged, all that other stuff. We got some questions from the community that they want to ask. But beyond that, I want to thank our sponsors, FAB Cards. Go to kfabecards.com. Get some sealed and singles for Flesh and Blood and other games. To BCW Supplies, use the code ISP10 at checkout at bcwsupplies.com for 10% off. I want to give an ups here to the Pumalavenko podcast, again, for hooking me up with this shirt. I love repping some of the community out there and what they are so generous with. So thank you very much for one of my favorite shirts. And finally, you're not losing if you're learning, friends, so keep playing the game. We'll catch you next time on ISP.